Let's talk about operators in C sharp. A lot of the operators are what you would expect them to be, but because C is in the C family of languages, that is C, C++, and C sharp, it has a couple of distinct operator behaviors or operators themselves. So let's talk about assignment and logical operators. All right, so we could create a variable and initialize it to something. It doesn't matter what. And of course, we can do normal assignment. Okay, so that says that I becomes 5. All right, well, what you're typically doing with variables like this is this sort of thing, where you increment something by 1. And of course, we're all used to seeing that, having looked at programming languages before. But if you sort of bring yourself back to what this was like before you knew how to program, that's actually kind of a strange looking statement. It seems to indicate that I is 1 more than itself, which is actually sort of a strange thing. So why did they do this? Well, this is historical, because originally, of course, C++ derived from or C sharp derived from C++, which derived from C. And the reason that they didn't like statements like this in C, because this is way back in computer science, is because that meant you actually had to look up the reference for I twice. You had to find it in the string table, and that was actually inefficient. We don't really worry about that with with modern optimizing compilers at this point. They're capable of handling that. But in the original C incarnation of C was that you sort of had to hand optimize things. And in fact, it's actually kind of convenient in terms of reading if you look at this, because you say I, and then you put the plus before the equal sign, and then the value that you want to add to I. So I gets incremented, or I is 1 more than it was before. So these two statements are identical. Right? And this is actually more compact, so it's sort of easier to read if you're used to reading C code. And it's actually easier to write. Okay, so you will see that, and of course there are analogs for this. In other words, just as there's a plus equals, there's a minus equals, and there's a multiplication equals, and there's a divide equals, etc., etc. Okay, typically people are just using increment or decrement, but certainly you could do that. And of course, you can put any number or any expression here that you want, so you don't have to add 1, you could add 5. However, it's very common to add 1. And in fact, it is so common to add 1, they added an operator just for that purpose. So there's something called the increment operator. Right? And it works like this, I plus plus. Okay, and you read that as I plus plus, or increment I, which is to say I becomes 1 more than it was before. All right, so that is an assignment. It actually assigns something to I. This is what's known, this version of increment, I'll just write it again, I plus plus, like so. This is known as increment after. Okay, in other words, what you're saying is, when does the assignment take place? Because this is an operation which adds 1 to I, and it's also an assignment. Okay, so increment after, because the plus signs are on the other side. So what does increment after mean? Well, let's actually create another variable, because I've got this one so many different values. And let's start that at 0. So we've got a new variable j. And if I were to, for example, write the value of j out, of course it would write the value 0, but I could also write out j++. And what does that mean? That means write the value of the expression j++, and then increment. Okay, so in other words, what this is going to write out is 0, but at the end of this statement, j will be 1. So that's what we mean by increment after. On the other hand, I could create another variable, and I could write that out, and I could say plus plus k. Okay, so this is increment after, and by the way, this is also known as auto increment. Right, these are all of the increments there that don't use the assignment statement, or sorry, that don't use the equal sign explicitly. Those are all auto increment, but people just usually call them increment. So this says auto increment, but not after. It says auto increment before. Okay, so how would that be different? Well, that means that it would add 1 to k and then return the value. So this would print out 1, whereas this would print out 0. So again, if we set j to 0 and then do auto increment after, the value of the expression would be 0, and then we increment j. If we do it this way, set k to 0 and increment before, we would go from 1 to 0, and then the result of the expression would be 1. Okay. Now, having said all that, I wouldn't worry about it too much. In general, I wouldn't try to assign this to something because it tends to get confusing. You will see that done in C, but typically not so much in C++. All right, so I would stick with just something like auto increment after without doing an assignment. Then you don't have to worry about the before and after part and other confusing things. But those certainly do exist, and you will see them in code. All right, and just as there are several forms of the assignment statement, that's the same is true of the increment, or auto increment. In other words, there's plus plus before and after, and minus minus, which is auto decrement. Which I think I will put in on a different line so as not to confuse the issue. And for that, we have minus minus, and again, before and after. Okay. And again, I would suggest just stay with auto increment or auto decrement after, and don't try to do assignments unless that really makes your algorithm easier to write and easier to read. Remember, part of what we're trying to do in software engineering is write code that's easy to read, not necessarily compact. Because at this point, machine cycles are extremely cheap, and optimizing compilers are very efficient, good at what they do. All right, and then let's also talk about logical operators. So there are several logical operators, and for the most part, they look familiar. Less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than or equal to, which is 2 equals, notice that's 2 equal signs rather than just 1, and not equal to. So notice the use of the exclamation point there. So this logical operator is not equal to, and you can also use the exclamation point by itself. So for example, if you had an expression like, let's say, let's create 2 variables and initialize them in place here. Okay, you could have a logical expression such as A not equal to B, like so, and we typically see that, for example, in an if statement. And we do something based on that. Or you could have a logical negation. So for example, you could even say bool, and this is my logical operator, let's say L. It looks too much like 1. Let's call it logic. Equals A equaling B. So in other words, my Boolean variable logic is either true or false because it's of type bool, and it's equal to this expression. In other words, if A is equal to B, then logic would be true. If B and A are not the same, then logic would be false. All right? And so we can use the logical operator. So for example, we could say if not logic. Okay. And so what we see here is that if logic itself is true, then not logic would be the opposite of that, and that would be false. Okay, so that's the not operator. Oops, is the not. operator. Okay, and so that's a couple of things that are distinct about operators in the C family of languages, assignment operators, auto increment, auto decrement, and a couple of logical operators.